And before I start, I'd just like to say, yes, I kind of understand that it's a bit confusing and in terms of the financial institutions, but I think also it's very hard for a lot of the participants because they're not finance people. But critically, we'll talk about this later, is get in contact through some mechanism with people who do have finance knowledge. If you don't have it, find a way of getting there. And I think, you know, like in Thailand, there is the Environmentally Sustainable Cities group, which is Monray is running. They can actually access, you know, finance expertise, and in fact ADB is about to provide some. So yeah, so I think there are possibilities. All right, I'll have a very brief presentation on some of the key instruments, and only 10 minutes worth, and then we can go into the next session. So let me share my screen again. There we go. So we can see that. Okay.
Yes. Very clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just go through very briefly some key financing instruments, and so we'll start with the key areas that we referenced in the earlier presentation, the distinction between debt and equity. Again, debt involves borrowing money to be repaid with interest or a share of the profits under Islamic banking, which will vary according to the creditworthiness of the borrower, the type of the project, the collateral available, and the term of the debt. It can take the form of a loan or a bond. And the critical thing is these various issues: the creditworthiness, the type of project, the collateral available, and the term of the debt. That will involve various interest rates according to the riskiness of the loan. Equity financing usually confers partial ownership and control of a corporate entity, but also exposes the provider to full or partial commercial risk of the project or the enterprise. Because of this higher risk, equity financing expects a higher return on that debt. A mix of both is usually needed in a privately financed project or PPP. And if there is going to be a mix of both, you need a structure to make that happen, so that the equity and the debt need to go into some kind of corporate structure. There are other types of instruments that provide either debt or equity. Things like blended finance facilities can provide debt or equity depending on how they're structured. Impact investment similarly could be debt or equity. Now, in terms of the overview of the financing instruments, going back to our talk about the sources, we talked about the different sources, and they're grouped into various areas that have common interests. Governments, line ministries, National Development Bank are all national entities. Overseas development assistance, accessed in general through those national institutions. Private and institutional and commercial sources. Those sources can be national, they can be international, but also they can be local. In the Philippines, in projects that I've been involved in, the local private sector has been very much involved in financing local PPPs. So, you know, there are possibilities at a local level within the city. And then there's others, households, etc. There are different types of instruments. There's bonds of various types, loans of various types, grants we talked about, risk mitigation activities like insurance and guarantees. And then there's the private activities like direct equity investment, land-based financing. We talked about direct taxes, user charges, and private equity. And then the different actors that can actually access those sources and use the instruments. So government implementation, PPP and SOE implementation, private sector, and households. So we need to be able to think about the different types of projects, the green projects that we want. Who is going to be the primary implementer, and what kind of financing do they need? And how can the entity that you're involved in, the local government, etc., foster those linkages. It may not be that the government is directly involved, but needs to foster the linkages for a particular project. In relationship to bonds, green bonds have been thought of in some areas as a silver bullet. Bonds in general are a very good instrument, but in general too, they are higher. They have higher transaction costs than normal than loans, or indeed green bonds have higher transaction costs than ordinary bonds, because in particular what we talked about earlier, if we're going to have a green bond, you need to prove the outputs and impacts of the bond, and that needs monitoring. So what we call MRV, monitoring, reporting, and validation. So we need to think about what are the use of the proceeds going to be, what are the project evaluation mechanisms we're going to use, how the proceeds are going to be managed, and how we're going to report on it. These activities are laid out in the green bond principles. So, but bonds have a number of good points in terms of they can finance a number of different types of projects. If they're general obligation bonds, they can access long-term financing, promote transparency and accountability. We talked about before the downsides is the higher processing costs, the higher MOV costs, and they are subject to market conditions. There have been, however, very good examples of the bonds to finance green projects. One is the Thailand's Public Debt Management Office issued a bond, and that in turn was used to finance the Bangkok Rapid Transit. So again, this is a case of the national government being able to issue a bond, and that being translated down to a local government project. Another area that we could think about as public-private partnerships, PPPs are things that local governments tend to be wary of because they are more complex to put together. But on the other hand, they are often ways of leveraging public assets. We talked about, looking at asset recycling. Those kind of projects can often be things like local markets that can be developed to higher density and better uses, including still markets, and being able to generate higher returns for local governments, but also green outcomes like being able to finance better wastewater treatment for these kind of markets, being able to look at public transport linkages that can be put into them, etc. There is a spectrum of PPP. It starts from pure public and goes through to pure private, and there are different sort of amounts of this. PPPs can be useful for a range of reasons. It can leverage government funds and assets. The proponent has the incentive to deliver if the contract is structured appropriately. There's potential cheaper financing, especially if there's EXIM financing involved, sort of EXIM banks in terms of countries that are supplying like buses or wastewater treatment plant machinery. EXIM banks can provide cheap finance. However, sometimes too, it's higher financing costs than local loans. There's a risk of conflict between public interest and profit. There's complex legal and regulatory challenges, and there's reduced public control over a project. We need to be aware of the fine print in PPP contracts. I come from Australia. Australia is often considered to be one of the best at PPP projects in the world, and that's because we have made every mistake it is possible to make when it comes to PPPs. So basically, there are many areas that you need to think about in terms of what are the kind of revenue guarantees, what are the foreign exchange adjustments, what are the exclusions from competition, what are the lock-in or step-in arrangements, what are the loopholes in performance activities, and there's going to be more complex monitoring, reporting, and validation. So all of these things, they need not put you off doing a PPP at all, but you need to be aware that there needs to be the right kind of expertise on the side of the government to make these things work. So as we talked about before, these are the kinds of activities that we're talking about. It starts at service contracts, which are short-term, through to concession contracts, which are very long-term. These are useful for a range of reasons, not just for the ones that we talked about, but also in terms of, things that just operating clarity. In the Pacific, for example, ADB uses PPP contracts to break what we call the build, neglect, rebuild cycle, in that a PPP operator can be, even if it's a management contract, can be held to account for doing the right level of maintenance. There are PPPs for drinking water, ADB and others assisted PTSMI to be able to structure water supply project in Indonesia. The SPV, the special purpose vehicle, which was assembled to actually undertake the project, could only raise 60% of the finance, but through the use of the project development facility to structure the project properly, a viability gap activity of the government to bridge the gap between what was financially possible and what was needed from the part of the community. The PPP was put together in a way that would actually make sense. Finally, the issue of blended finance, both in Malaysia and the Philippines, we've seen examples of blended finance structures that can attract additional concessional and private finance. They can mobilize finance at scale. They can develop green projects if they're structured appropriately. In other words, if they have a project development facility inside them. They can be expensive if they have large foreign exchange components to them, and that foreign exchange component is not hedged. They can have higher establishment costs, given that we will need to do monitoring, reporting, and validation of the projects. For example, what was done in Tamil Nadu in India was a very good pooled finance vehicle. It had inputs from the government of Tamil Nadu. It also had aid agencies providing support, particularly USAID providing a partial credit guarantee, and the kind of bonds that were issued by this water and sanitation fund were then guaranteed to the point where the institutional investors, the private sector institutional investors, could do it and could finance or buy the bonds. That made a very much larger amount of finance available for these type of projects. And so I'll stop there. So there is a set of instruments that are available, and again, it's important that the range of those instruments be considered, and I think the next exercise is about that. Thank you.